I'm going to go ahead and get started. Can everybody back there hear me? We're not sure we turned on the mic properly. We're not the tech people here. Can you guys hear me in the back? Okay, good. I thought so. I usually have a big mouth without a microphone, so I'm good. My name is Nikki Williams. I'm the president of the Sumter Education Task Force here. And I want to welcome you all here. You all look great. When we started this enterprise to bring Ceresta Smith here to Sumter, I'm not going to lie, we sat together and we said, do you think we can get like 10 or 15 people in a room together to hear Ceresta speak? And we started counting our friends, like how many people can we like force to come? So I'm really grateful that you're all out here. This enterprise has been quite a journey for all of us. And getting Ceresta here took a lot of effort. And if I could first just recognize some of the people who made it possible. So a few ladies, if you're comfortable with it, and gentlemen, I think he's hiding back there. He's been supportive to us. He's our man with the camera. If you could stand up if you're comfortable with standing up. Those of you who helped us get everything together, Mary, Joan, Elaine, Leanne, Parrish, Tammy. There's others back there. Sylvia, I can't forget Sylvia, Catherine. It's been quite a group effort. One of the most amazing things about this group of community members that I have found has been their dedication and their commitment and their drive. When we came together as parents, some of us, as community members, all of us, I found that we were all vast and diverse. We have a whole group we're awash with different talents, and some of us have children in the schools, some of us don't, some of us have never had children, some of us are educators or were educators, but what we all shared was a commitment to public education. What we all shared was a respect for our educators here in Sumter County. Absolutely. Our educators, our administration, our board members, I was just so amazed that we had such a united vision, an idea of what a wonderful public education system we have in Sumter County. And I think that the biggest thing that we all share is the absolute and firm belief that every child in Sumter County deserves the best possible public education that we can provide for them. And so we started reaching out to other parents, to other educators within the community, certainly to our board members who have been gracious enough sometimes to listen to us ramble. And we've been so grateful to have that platform. And across the nation, we found other parents who were concerned about what was happening in their public schools too, and who were absolutely committed to public education. And so that's why we've brought Ceresta Smith here tonight from Florida. She is a wealth of knowledge. She's an educator. And somebody else is going to give you a little more information on her. I'm going to close by reading to you our mission statement for the Sumter Education Task Force. And we are a group in so much as we're a bunch of parents and community members who meet on a quasi-regular basis, usually the Thursday after the board meetings, to see where we are in public education in Sumter and what direction we can have in supporting our teachers and in supporting our schools, and what input we can have, and to make sure that we continue to have a voice in that. So our mission for the Sumter Education Task Force is to strengthen community support for our students, teachers, and schools through effective communication between district leadership, educators, and parents, thus ensuring that public education continues to have a public voice in Sumter. And with that, I'm going to introduce to you Luther Barnett, who is the president-elect of the Sumter chapter of the South Carolina Educators Association, and also an English teacher here at Sumter High School.
Hi. Can everybody hear me? I don't have anything prepared, but I've been thinking about two things lately. Edward R. Murrow and Ishmael Reed. Ishmael Reed wrote a poem called Dualism, and it was inspired by Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man, which is a 20th century novel, perhaps one of the best novels about race in our country. And the poem goes, I am outside of history. It looks hungry in its cage. I wish I had some peanuts. I am inside of history. It's hungrier than I thought. And I think, that says a lot about how we get kind of caught up in the history of things. The other thing by Edward R. Murrow that I've been thinking about is in his amazing and fearless fight with McCarthy, at a time when people were promoting fear in our country, he said bravely, dissent is not disloyalty. You have every right to speak out when you recognize something that's wrong. And you should be able to speak with people that have different ideas and not be afraid. Everything in this country depends upon discourse. We cannot have the ideal republic without being able to speak with people who have different ideas. We should never be afraid to talk. So, I'd like to introduce to you one of the ladies behind the parent movement, and she's been working tirelessly, and she's really an amazing woman, Parrish Raven.
Good evening. I love public education. The positive influences that various teachers had on my life, as well as the fond memories from my years in school, they're too numerous to count. Besides my parents, I can easily say that my teachers influenced my life more than anyone. Public school teachers have continued to shape my life even as an adult. During the last decade, while volunteering in Sumter County Public Schools, I have learned some of the most important life lessons of all. Each year, I find myself feeling a deep sense of gratitude as I watch these public school teachers transform the lives of the children of our community. You see, it's not just about my 3 children, but I have been inspired by our public school teachers as they positively impact the lives of every single child that walks into their classrooms, regardless of the child's circumstances or abilities. Quality public education is about the common good of our community. I've come to realize there's no profession I have a deeper respect for than that of a public school teacher. To the teachers who are in the audience tonight, thank you for investing in the lives of the children of Sumter, for the children here are our future. With that being said, it's my pleasure to welcome our speaker to the stage this evening. Ceresta Smith is a 23-year veteran educator who has taught grades 6 through 12 reading language arts, as well as beginning and advanced television production. She earned her national board certification in young adult English language arts in 2002, and now serves as a teacher, leader, and mentor. As a committed educator and activist, Ms. Smith founded the Concerned Teacher Coalition in 2009 to address the inequities in Miami-Dade County's predominantly African-American public schools. One of the original organizers of Save Our Schools March and National Call to Action, she continues to champion for equity and quality teaching in America's public schools. Currently, she is one of the founders and administrators of United Opt-Out National, an organization that is working to end the destructive nature of high-stakes testing. Ms. Smith's vision statement is inspiring to me and reads as follows: quality public education is a basic human right for all children, one which must remain in the hands of our communities and out of the hands of big business, corporate reformers, and politicians. If we are to save and transform public education into spaces where all children have the opportunity to flourish, grow, question, challenge, think, and be prepared as democratic citizens, we must begin with the fight to end the high-stakes testing movement. Please join me in giving Ms. Ceresta Smith a warm Sumter, South Carolina welcome.
Thank you very much. And I've been eating such good food. I'm telling you, you guys can try and get somebody fatter than what they already are around here. Recently, I attended an education summit. I was one of the presenters in Selma, Alabama. This was not this past weekend, but the weekend before last. Selma annually hosts what's called a Jubilee to commemorate Bloody Sunday. And I don't know how many of you know what Bloody Sunday is, but it was the original march that Dr. King, along with other SCLC members, organized to march from Selma, Alabama to Montgomery in effort to obtain voters' rights for the African American community there in Alabama. They were being disenfranchised and denied their right to vote. Well, that particular Sunday, when they made their first attempt, many of the community members that tried to march were beat down. They were beaten by the police, no doubt. And it was a peaceful march. It wasn't doing anything but doing what we do when we show that we want to exercise our freedom of our speech, our right to dissent. Anyway, needless to say, the march didn't occur that day. The following week, however, the President Kennedy sent in National Guard to make sure they could continue with the march, and they eventually were able to march from Selma to Montgomery. Well, this year, it was special because voters' rights are being challenged again in the legislation that's coming in many states that is creating almost like a poll tax or something comparable to a poll tax, something comparable to a literacy test, comparable to the many of the ways that they disenfranchised voters during the Jim Crow era. Anyway, within the context of the Education Summit, we begin to present information to those people that attended the summit. One person in particular, Dr. Sheila Evans, before she began, she greeted the audience, but she greeted the audience with a Maasai greeting. Now, the Maasai tribe is a tribe in Kenya, and they have customs that they still practice from eons and eons of time ago. This particular greeting that they use, like we would say hello, like we would say good day, good morning, instead they say, and how are the children? That's how they greet their friends, their family, anyone they encounter. And they expect to hear the response, the children are well. When she introduced that, I began to think to myself, well, here in America, how are the children? Can I honestly say the children are doing well? And when I think about it and reflect upon it, I don't think I can honestly say that because they're being robbed slowly but surely of the right to have a free, quality public education that is without inequity and that provides for their futures and their security here in the United States of America. Why do I feel that way, and why has it come to the point where I can honestly say that I don't think the children are well, and why has it come to the point where I was a co-founder and an organizer of an organization that is spreading a message that we need to begin to opt our children out of high-stakes testing. People say we need testing. We need to assess our students. We find out a lot of information about assessments, and I think that is very true, and I support quality assessments. But when it comes to high-stakes testing, it has taken education to a level which, to me, has created a big divide in terms of equity that's delivered. It's creating a big divide in how children are able to learn and thrive in their educational institution. And this, to me, crosses all demographic areas and populations. And how has it come to do that? I can start with my own narrative. 4 years ago, I was teaching for quite a while, about 10, 12 years in a what's labeled high-performing school, a high school in Miami-Dade County. It was a good school. Can't say it any other way, but it was a good school. It was filled with great educators. It was filled with students that applied themselves for the most part. It was filled with educators that would work with students that didn't want to apply themselves, and the community worked well with each other. It was an established community filled with what I say, people that care. They also had the materials and the tools they needed to get the job done and to get the job done well. I was asked to leave that school and go to what was called a low-performing school. When I got to that low-performing school, I was shocked with the inequity, what I experienced in the high-performing school in contrast to what was going on in the low-performing school. When I got there, I saw teachers that had no academic freedom. I saw students that were denied curricular materials that were available in the other schools. I saw students who had to work with scripted curricula that did not lend itself to creative thinking, did not lend itself to problem solving, did not lend itself to getting students to learn how to cooperate and collaborate with each other. Students were denied elective courses in many cases. They sat in 3 blocks of English language arts. They sat in 2 blocks of math and sometimes 2 blocks of science. Why? These were the courses that were being tested. When it came to their electives, many of the students did not have them. The teachers were not able to bring in any of their expertise and knowledge. And we're talking veteran educators that had been teaching in excess of 10, 15 years. They were being told, these are the materials you're going to use. This is the benchmark calendar you're going to go by. You're going to drive instruction via benchmarks. And you're not going to complain, because if you do, you won't last. You won't stay here. In other words, they were under siege. Herbert Cole called these schools educational panopticons. And it's questionable how much teaching and learning goes on that's going to help these kids grow into people that can problem solve and think and create. The other thing that bothered me when it came to those scripted curriculums, you're attempting to prepare students to be able to have the knowledge and the skills, the basic facts, the processes, the ability to take standardized tests that are on grade level. But the materials, when I flipped through and looked at what they were being asked to use, maybe were materials that could be used in 4th or 5th grade. And this was shocking to me. When I got there, they were telling me, Miss Smith, you've got to use these materials. You're going to be a teacher leader here. You're going to help these teachers implement these curriculums. You're going to assist these teachers and facilitate them and teach them how to deliver a good lesson. And I said, well, I can't do it with what you got here. And I know you don't expect me to use what you have here because that is not going to do it. And so automatically I became the teacher that could not be controlled, the teacher that does not listen, the teacher that is turning into a problem. It took me 2 weeks to turn into a problem, and that was it. Okay? And I brought my own materials in. It's just that simple. I brought what I knew works. I made sure the children had rich textual materials to work with to foster and build their literacy skills. I also said we're not going to teach to a test and make this whole year into a test prep factory. Now, when No Child Left Behind was first mandated, we were kind of ahead of the game in Florida because we had JEB. And I think you guys know who JEB is. Texas was ahead of the game before George became the president because they had George in Texas as the governor. They began to implement what JEB referred to as the A-plus plan. And the A-plus plan was basically a market-based approach to teaching and learning. Of course, when George got in office, No Child Left Behind came with him. And what we see now and what we're doing now is a product, all of us are dealing with products of No Child Left Behind and the mandates for federal funding that each of our states had to adhere to just to get the money, per se. With it came test-based accountability. With it came constant testing, standardized testing. With it came many of our states that began to essentially teach to a test. Wasn't that bad initially. Testing would come around in the spring, and maybe you would take 6 to 8 weeks of test prep out of your school year. In Florida, what was 3 days in the spring has now morphed into a baseline assessment 2 weeks after school has started, an interim assessment maybe 2 months after school has started, a winter assessment that comes 4 months after school has been in session, eventually the spring test, and then the post-test. It's turned into 3 to 4 weeks at a time where testing is chunked and teachers that are teaching. And in Florida now, kindergarten through 10th grade, they have to focus on this test prep. So it's morphed into an animal that is, to me, interfering with quality public education. But there's other things that have come along with this testing. And there's other legislated policies that have come along with this testing as well. After a while, I began to ask myself, what's going on here? We have segregated schools, worse than what we had pre-Brown versus the Board of Education in Topeka, Kansas. We've got 2 types of education that are being served to our American children. One that allows for productive and creative thinking and problem solving, and one that doesn't. And I began to organize, I began to read, I began to try to assess what really is going on here. I'm putting myself out on a limb, I'm screaming to the top of my lungs, I'm having administrators and district folk identify me and target me as a troublemaker, but at the same time I'm watching our kids lose their ability to think and reason. And then I began to notice that that wonderful school that I left was starting to look like the low-performing school that I went to in regards to what was going on with teaching and learning. Suddenly, these scripted curriculums were being used in that school as well. Suddenly, the teachers were complaining like I was complaining, a lot more than just me. And we got our heads together and we began to talk. And then I found out, well, it's not only just going on in the state of Florida. It's going on across the nation. And it's coming with all sorts of scandals. And it's coming with all sorts of legislative policies. But it looks like, it's starting to look like, that through all these scandals and through all these legislative policies and through all these children that are not graduating from high school ill prepared to function in the college setting because they don't know how to write well, they don't know how to read challenging material, they look good on paper, a lot of them, because they're passing these standardized tests, but all of a sudden they're learning test-taking strategy and that's it. But I begin to notice that all through this, somebody's making a whole lot of money and a whole lot of profit. Pearson, test-taking manufacturers and publishers, is one such company that is. In 2008, they were a $500 million a year profiting company. Now we're talking about annually billions of dollars. They're profiting. They're profiting from the test. They're profiting from the test prep materials. They're profiting from the people that can go in and search out and see who is cheating. They're making all this money. And there's another group that's making a lot of money too. Well, suddenly, our schools are terrible. The achievement gap is not getting closed. We're cheating the impoverished and minority students. There's a problem here. 25% of our teachers are not good teachers, and we got to get rid of them. And what is telling us they're not good teachers? The test. The test that they're taking. We got to identify all these bad teachers, and we got to get rid of them. We got to come up with new evaluation systems for these teachers. And the people that come up with these new evaluation systems, we can make them rich, like a gentleman named Marzano. We can make other people rich as they come in with their administrative teams that, for some reason, the administrators are making well into six figures, but the teachers have to go without raises 3 or 4 years in a row. But there's something funny about these administrators as well. Somebody named Eli Broad has created a school where they're training these administrators to go in particular communities, push these market-based reforms, and those administrators are getting paid very well to do it. And many of them look like me. And I have to ask myself, are they really serving the needs of the communities that look like me as well? And you begin to wonder, when you have students, like I said, that leave high school and cannot function in academic settings of higher learning. When we talk about what's called the achievement gap, I like to refer to it as the opportunity gap. We see that at one point in America's history, the achievement gap was closing. In the 70s and the 80s, when they began to do certain things like integrate the schools, not just integrate the student body population, but integrate the faculties as well. When they began to come up with the magnet concept of education that helped to diversify schools. When they began to give money where money was actually needed and provide support systems for schools that were in impoverished communities that had high populations as well as special needs students. We started closing that achievement gap. But all of a sudden, lo and behold, No Child Left Behind, where there was, according to George Bush and according to Jeb Bush, there were all these schools that were failing because suddenly we're not scoring that well on national assessments. Suddenly, our students that are coming into this country unable to speak English as a second language are not getting the education they need to be able to function. Suddenly, our special needs students are not being challenged enough. They need to be tested too. And the teachers that don't show that they're creating growth with these students need to be looked at with scrutiny. And so we have the hype, accountability, data-driven instruction, We have to begin to use one assessment to evaluate students, teachers, and their schools. This one assessment can do that. And we can do it by coming up with complicated math formulas that can tell whether a teacher is a quality educator or not, because it'll show whether that teacher has created growth from when she got the student at the beginning of the year to when he or she had the student by the end of the year. I don't know how many of you know what happened recently in New York, where they published the teachers in New York, their rankings based on these value-added measurements. One teacher in particular that was at the bottom of all the teachers in New York City. Reporters begin to talk badly, actually slander this teacher as far as I'm concerned. They began to talk about how this woman needs to be fired immediately. They picked on this one woman. When it was investigated, they found out that that was one of the best teachers in her particular school. That the value-added measure really didn't depict what that teacher was capable of. And then we look a little further and find out that over 50% of the value-added measures were not correct. They were judging teachers that had been out on maternity leave for 2 years and didn't even have students they were teaching. But we have states that are implementing evaluation systems for teachers that are going to use these very types of mathematical equations that have over a 50% error rate. I'm in Florida. We receive Race to the Top money. With that, we promised that we were going to start basing at least in Florida 50% of a teacher's evaluation on these value-added measurements. Now, the funny thing is, some of us in Florida do not teach any of the accountability subjects that are tested. So those of us that don't, like myself, that teaches 11th and 12th grade, 50% of my evaluation will be based on what the whole school building does in 10th grade reading testing. I've never seen the students. I don't know whom they are. But my evaluation is going to be based 50% on what they do on this test. Now, they already gave us merit pay based on this particular school year. They had $25,000 for teachers that they deemed highly qualified. They had $1,250 for teachers that were showing improvement with their students. They had $4,000 to $8,000 bonus pays for teachers that showed that they were up there in the top echelon of teachers. My husband is also a teacher in Miami-Dade County Public Schools. This last school year, he was working in one of the sanctioned schools. My husband has always, while teaching students the math skills they need, been able to raise test scores. Now, he receives zero pay, merit pay, after all his hard work and all his hard effort. I didn't have any of the students that received $1,250. Go figure. These are the things they're implementing in schools now. This is what they're doing to teachers. Now, for this year, it just was based on bonus and merit pay. But by 2014 in Florida, this will determine whether or not I get to not only get a pay raise, if they ever decide they're going to give us one again, but it will also determine whether or not I can keep my job. Because if I have 2 years in a row where I'm considered below average as an educator based on these value-added measures, 50%, and then the other part will come from classroom observation, I can lose my job. After working in the field for over 20 years, I could possibly lose my job. Now, here's the funny thing. Hillsborough County did a pilot of how this would work. They were given money by one of our corporate friends, Bill Gates. I'll talk a little bit later about our corporate friends. But Bill Gates gave Hillsborough County money to implement this system and use it to evaluate educators. I recently ran into one of the teachers that sat at the table to organize this and plan. I asked her, well, how did Hillsborough County come out with using the value-added measurement to determine teacher quality, coupled with the classroom observations? She said, well, you know, Ceresta, the funny thing is, all the teachers that teach in the predominantly black schools end up with ratings demonstrating ineffective teaching. The teachers that teach in the best school districts with the best, highest performing students, they got all the bonus money. And she goes, we got to do something about that. When you look at how those measures operate, they say that poverty, they say that compromised ability to eat well, they say this has nothing to do, all children can learn and achieve. But it's funny that the teachers that are teaching in these schools that are high poverty communities are always looking like they're the worst teachers. What's up with that? In Miami-Dade County, in the low-performing schools, they implemented much of what No Child Left Behind said you could do with schools that were low-performing. They used the turnaround, where you ship out half your faculty and staff, where you ship out administrators. In fact, the school that I went to, in 5 years, they saw 7 different administrators. Each year they would get rid of 30, 40 plus teachers and bring in Teach for America teachers. I don't know if you're familiar with Teach for America, but it's a private program, corporate entity, that takes graduates of Ivy League schools. They give them a 5-week crash course and send them and eventually places them in schools that are in low-income communities. The TFAs are going to save the day. That's what we're told. Unfortunately, a lot of them, when they get in the schools, they find that they've been sold a bad bill of goods. They find that they're ill-prepared to handle the challenges of teaching in school communities that, number one, have never been able to have any stability with staff. Number two, are forced to teach to a test all year. Number three, have no autonomy. And number four, constantly have teams of people coming from the district and from the state to evaluate and assess and progress monitor how they're doing. Many of the TSAs don't even last till December. Many of them serve their contract with 2 to 3 years, and I call it teacher on the cheap because the district only has to pay half their salary. The rest of it comes from private foundations. After they do their 2 or 3 years, most of them get out if they last the whole 2 or 3 years. And many of them, when they leave, they begin to talk about how bad TFA is for public education in America. As these schools continue in their cycle of failure, the other thing that can happen is they can be taken over by a private managed charter in the state of Florida. One of the things that happens often with this private managed, with this market-based approach to education is that our legislators legislate policies that allow private enterprise to come in and profit off of taxpayers' dollars. And I, as a taxpayer, I have a serious problem with that. They took, in Florida, the cap off of the amount of vouchers that could be distributed to allow children to go from public school to private schools. They took the cap off charters. They allowed the corporate entities that manage charters to come in and manage many of the charter schools. Now, the sad thing in Florida is that with all charters that are not coming under district jurisdiction, that are coming under private management, there's no accountability. In South Florida, there was a charter school that wasn't really a good school. It wasn't really educating the children properly, but they had rented the space for the school. They had student population. They were given the $5,600 for each kid that they had enrolled in the school. And by night, it was a strip club. So you had school by day that wasn't an effective school, and you had strip club by night. Literally. Strip club. Real strip club. Okay? That's a different kind of education. Yes, it is. You also had situations where they set up online charter schools, virtual education, where they listed children's names. They supposedly enrolled them in these virtual schools, but when they went to investigate, there was no such thing. Now, these are situations where people have received taxpayer money. There's been no accountability, and then there's been no indictments, because I call it theft. But there's been no indictments. You also have situations where there have been charter schools set up that are performing well, doing very well. There's a particular man that has a construction business that has started a string of charter schools across the country. There are 6 of them in Florida. He places all the charter schools in high-income areas where he knows he's going to have student body populations that are going to achieve, and the parents are going to demand quality education and high achievement. But the funny thing is, he receives money from the state for each one of those children. He built the buildings where he put those children, so the state also pays him the money to lease the property. And he feels like there's no conflict of interest there. And apparently the state doesn't either. But this man has been able to amass a lot of dollars in doing this, providing the space and providing the kids to fill the space and get the money for the leases as well as the children. So when you talk about school choice, that's another part of this market-based reform. There are many things going on that, again, they're taking money from traditional public school education and it's landing in the hands of private profiteers. Meanwhile, you have these children that are still considered low-performing students. And you have these teachers that are now being attached to these low-performing students. We're not providing any support services or wraparound services for these schools, but the teachers are going to be judged and based on how well they can perform on standardized tests. So, what we see coming down the pipe eventually is that the majority of teachers that teach in predominantly black schools will end up losing their jobs because their evaluations are not going to look good. We also do have a state that is going to keep a consistent failing population through what they legislate. Case in point. This was the first year that in South Florida there were no failing schools this past school year, 2010 to 2011. Many of the schools that were failing achieved C, B, and 2 of them received A status. Well, the state decided we have to increase the rigor of the reading test. Not only do we have to increase the rigor of the reading test, we have to make sure that if a school doesn't have 25% of their population scoring a 3 on this reading test, they will automatically be an F school. They will come under sanction. Once you're under sanction, there are dollars attached to that. We can come in and turn those schools around because we got this other bill sitting here called the Parent Empowerment Bill. With this Parent Empowerment Bill, supposedly we will empower the parents to vote in their communities and vote to shut down the schools and turn them into private managed charters. 2 things going on. You had the increased rigor, scores. They did a simulation. They took the schools based on the achievement from this past school year. They said, well, what will this look like with this increased rigor and this requirement of 25%? And there was two additional requirements, too. Suddenly, two subgroups that weren't counted in the accountability, we're going to count them in now. And those two subgroups would be your special needs students. They have to sit for this test now. They have to achieve a level 3. And then you have your second language students, first year second language students. And I think you all know that many of Haitian students migrate to Miami. You constantly have an influx of Spanish-speaking students that migrate to Florida. But they're expected to pass this test and achieve at the same level as anyone else and will be part of the accountability. And if 25% of those schools that have those populations at a high number do not get them to, they will be an automatic failing school. The community finally came together and said, you know what? I've been screaming this ever since this stuff has been going on. There's blatant racism and discrimination here. This cannot go. We are not buying into it. Parent groups, the women's groups came together, civil rights groups came together, and they all stayed at Tallahassee and protested these two pieces of legislation. They got rid of the parent empowerment bill that would have allowed them to come in and turn these schools automatically into private managed charters. That got defeated. But I warn you, it's coming. Everybody in this country is going to face similar legislation. The other thing they did, they got them to modify this mandated 25% achieving level 3. Instead of being reduced to an automatic F, they will now go down just one letter grade. It's not the victory that we wanted, but it's better than what they were going to do. Last summer, I, along with other people, participated in a march on Washington. Like minds around the country, there were several of us. Anthony Cody, he was the creator, the co-founder, well, the founder of Teachers' Letters to Obama. Anthony is a national board certified teacher in California. He started organizing people to write letters to Obama in regards to the reauthorization of No Child Left Behind and in regards to Race to the Top. Many of us expected when Obama became president that No Child Left Behind would be just kicked out of the way, because it's in the way of quality education, but it wasn't. He instead added fuel to the fire with Race to the Top, with this accountability and this mandate that if you get this funding that you have to tie teachers' pay to these assessments. Now, Obama, there's somewhat of a incongruency here, because when he speaks in regards to what he sees as quality education, he says we shouldn't be teaching to a test. We need quality curricula. We need good qualified educators in everybody's classroom. And the focus should not be on just teaching for a high-stakes multiple choice test. But then he has an education secretary that's all he's pushing. The people, when we went to Washington, D.C., we hosted workshops that had similar to what I'm doing now, just teach-ins, trying to educate the public as to what's going on. Good workshops, quality workshops. We didn't have enough space for the teachers that wanted to attend. In the workshops, one of the things that I noticed is that everybody was saying the test, the test, the test. All this is happening because of the test. That previous year, my daughter was a sophomore in high school at the time. She's a junior now. I opted my daughter out. I personally said, I'm going to take a stance here. This assessment is not the tool that it's supposed to be. It's racist. It's compromising the quality of education. my daughter is not going to do it. My husband and I sat and talked, and we opted her out. We wrote a letter to her principal saying that she is not to participate in any standardized testing at this point. Every record that's in her of standardized testing that's in her student file, we want it removed. We want no evidence of standardized testing whatsoever, and she will not take one again until the assessments are made to do what they're supposed to do, which is suggest trends, help people, inform people as to how you can modify teaching and learning. It's not going to be used as a punitive tool that it's being used as. So anyway, I shared that with the people in Washington, D.C., and there were other people with like minds like me that were opting their children out as well. So when we left there, we said, you know what, we need to start a national organization called United Opt-Out. We need to make it an organization that people can opt out to the degree that they're comfortable. It may be just changing the narrative when you're talking about accountability and when you're talking about data-driven instruction. Maybe it could be to the extent where you decide to opt your child out, like myself. I encountered during this opting out process, of course, a level of resistance from the school district. They told me my child was going to have to sit in the testing room. And I said, well, you know, as a teacher, I proctor these tests, and I know for a fact that while you're in that room, it goes on for about 3 or 4 hours. What is she going to do while she's in that room for 3 or 4 hours? Well, ma'am, she's just going to have to sit there. I said, are you saying she has to sit there with nothing to read, nothing to occupy her? She's to sit there and stare into space? Yes, ma'am. That's what she's going to have to do. I told him at that point, I said, well, you know what? That sounds a little bit like child abuse to me, and if you make my daughter do that, it will be reported to the authorities. Suddenly, she didn't have to sit in the testing room anymore. They changed their story. She's continuing to opt out because in Florida, as I think with your district, if a child doesn't pass the assessment or take it in their sophomore year, they continue to say they have to take it up through their senior year or when they pass it or eventually take it. So I had to start the conversation again this year. It got to the point where they were threatening, once again, new principal at her school, to set her in a testing room for these hours to stare into space. And this time, I didn't have to join the conversation. My daughter told them, I'm not going to the testing room. If anyone, including you, Miss Baglos, which is her administrator, puts their hands on me and tries to make me go, I will call the police. Once again, they decided they were going to leave her alone. But they challenge parents that make this decision. That's what I'm sharing with you. But parents do have defense. They have 3 Supreme Court decisions, and I can't remember all of them. I have them written down. But there were 3 very important Supreme Court decisions that protect parents in this case when it comes to making educational decisions for their child. Those particular decisions, along with due process clauses in the 14th Amendment, enable a parent decision to supersede any state law in regards to the choices that are made for their child and in the area of education. So they know they can't trump federal law, and they know it's a growing movement at this point that parents are opting their students out. And one of the things we're going to do to spread that message is the end of this month, March 30th through April 2nd, we're going to be in Washington, D.C., along with a whole host of our friends, and we're going to occupy the Department of Education to spread our message even more. One of the nice things about the March on Washington that we did have, it did experience somewhat of a media blackout, and most people found out after the fact, and only after Matt Damon, who I can say is a wonderful man, stood there with us and addressed our crowd. He ended up cursing one of the reporters out that were asking him very, what can I say, questions that angered him, and he ended up using a couple of expletives. And he said, you're paying these people SHITTY pay. They're working long hours, and you're trying to hold this accountability thing over their head. Get real. But anyway, that's what made, how many of you actually saw that? Just a few of you, see? So there was really a serious media blackout with this March on Washington because they really didn't want to publicize it, but we did do it. And we will be back in Washington again, like I said, for the occupation of the DOE, but there will also be a conference for parents, educators, students that Save Our Schools is going to host in August, the first weekend of August. So that's one other thing we're going to do. And we're going to try and spread the message that we have to change the narrative, we have to change the culture, we have to make sure that we're ensuring that our children are getting the best education that they can. Here in South Carolina, your governor has signed for a waiver for No Child Left Behind. Sounds like a good thing, doesn't it? Because let's be real. You had a federal law that mandated that all schools demonstrate reading proficiency and math proficiency for all students. We're talking about 100% by 2014. Now, you know and I know that this is the planet Earth. There's no perfect in the planet. It just doesn't work that way. You're defying the laws of the universe, and those of you that believe in God, the Heavenly Father, you're defying His laws as well. There's no such thing as perfect. But we had a federal law that mandated perfect. Well, we got to do something about that, right? So the best thing that the Obama administration could come up with is these waivers. And states could apply for these waivers. And now districts, because a lot of states are not applying for the waiver, districts are being offered the opportunity to apply for it as well. Well, your state, just like my state, applied for the waiver. Now, we've already been attached to the hip of tying teacher pay to student assessment and teacher job security assessments. You guys are going to have to start that now. With this waiver, you're going to have to, if you had any caps on charters and vouchers dealing with private profit, that cap will be gone as well. So you're looking at your teachers now, and those of you that are parents, you're looking at your students and your children deciding the fate of their teachers' pay and the fate of their teachers' job security when they sit down to take these tests. That's coming down the pipe. One of the things that I asked that Parish make sure you guys have is a list of websites so you can begin to inform yourself about what's going on. You should always look and see what's going on in your state legislative bodies as well when it comes to education policy. Alabama's facing the same thing. I can list a whole bunch of states. You have some states that I'm so proud of. Seattle is one. Seattle's been fighting all this stuff tooth and nail. And they have a very informed public and community that's continually fighting these things tooth and nail. There are other states as well that have managed to minimize the damage of No Child Left Behind. And I think South Carolina, with your education system, you were one that was kind of staying out of the fray, so to speak. But as you get administrators placed in your community that are trained by the Eli Broad program, you have to not judge them harshly, not say they got to go right now, but you have to get these administrators to realize that you have to work for the good of the community and not for the good of Eli Broad. And we do have administrators that are becoming activists in this game. you have a group of New York administrators that have become very strong activists. We do not want to evaluate our teachers in this way. It is not right. We are starting to form strong groups to fight against this. You also have, in our state, Florida, you have a gentleman named Rick Roach. And I love this guy. I had to email him and tell him how much I love him for what he did. He himself, he's a school board member in Orange County. He sat down and took our reading, he sat down and took our reading test. Now, keep in mind, he's a school board member, so he's dealing with complex budgetary issues. He's reading complex documents. He's having to make decisions using creative and critical thinking capabilities. He sat down and took the reading test and scored 62%. And he goes, this is a trick test. And he goes, I know I can read. But I only scored 62%. And in that case, he would have been assigned these remedial reading classes, his electives taken away to have to be assigned these. And he would face the reality if he didn't get it passed, he would not receive a standard high school diploma. So he didn't just stop there. He began to go into the schools because you had 41,000 students that could not pass that reading test and that were being denied standard diplomas because of it. And, of course, it retards everything. If you're trying to go to college or get into a program, you don't have a standard high school diploma, so your life is on hold, so to speak, unless you find an alternative method of getting a credential such as a GED. He began to go into the schools and personally meet with these students. One day he actually was in a school. He was looking at a student that was in one of these remedial reading classes that hadn't passed FCAT reading. And he noticed that the boy was reading on his Nook a Shakespearean play. He goes, and he just asked him, what is it you're reading? And the child told him the name of the particular tragedy that he was reading. And he goes, oh, are you doing this for your class? No, I enjoy reading Shakespearean plays. This is something I just love to do. And he looked at the boy and he said, you can read Shakespeare, but you can't pass FCAT? And he began to ask the kids to share their narrative, what they thought their problems were with FCAT. And they shared them. And basically his sentiment, trick questions, answers that, that vague. It's difficult to figure out which is the correct response, which is the incorrect. Some of the answers seem like they're subjective. If you were raised this way or have this cultural experience, you'll answer it like this. And if you were raised that way with that cultural experience, you'll answer it like this. And so he's on a campaign now to shut down the remedial reading programs where, again, you have all these companies that are making all this money off of this remedial reading that I know when I went to school, they didn't have that. They didn't spend all this money to make sure they had these materials with this scripted curricula to remediate kids that couldn't read. When I went to school, they hired or had in place reading specialists that worked individually with these kids. So he's saying we're spending all this ridiculous amount of money, and he goes in, and furthermore, it seems like all this is about certain people making a whole lot of money and not really educating these kids. And so he's another one. There's John Kuhn, superintendent of a school district in Texas. He joined us on that march, and he spoke about how he sees his Latino population being disenfranchised and marginalized through high-stakes testing, through No Child Left Behind, and through these market-based reforms. And during that, we were talking, and he said, I don't know if when I get back to Texas, I'm going to have a job. But at this point, I don't care. Matt Damon has a mother. And you can see the apple does not fall far from the tree. Dr. Nancy Carlson Page. She's an educator at a university in Massachusetts, and she teaches educators of the little ones, pre-K through first, second, third grade, early school education. She trains educators. She visited South Florida recently, and I arranged for her to be able to go in a couple schools. And when she left that day, she was so aghast that we now have standardized testing of students in kindergarten. And if they don't pass with a certain score, they're forced to go to Saturday school. If Saturday school doesn't help by the end of the year, they're forced to go to summer school. And I don't know about you, but my brother and I were in kindergarten together. His birthday came in October. Mine came in September. We were 11 months apart, so we went through school all together. In kindergarten, he didn't say a word to anybody but me. When it came time for high school graduation, he was the merit scholar that went to school on academic scholarship. Go figure. If he were in this day and age, he would have been deemed a low-performing child. He would have been forced to go to Saturday school. He would have been forced to go to summer school. But when we were in kindergarten, oh, he'll mature. Nothing's written in stone for a kid that's 4 or 5 years old. He'll step up to the plate. He'll be fine. Not to worry. And that's why I can honestly say today that I can't say the children are well. Now, I would like this to be a two-way dialogue here, a conversation. So any of you that has any questions or anything to share, let's start with that. Yes, sir. Well, the NAACP has recognized, and this is something that in Selma we had NAACP, Action Network, Rainbow Push. These people were there. But the NAACP has been on this for a minute. One other thing that experienced a media blackout is that in the summer of 2010, I think it was, 6 civil rights organizations came together. And they published a document and submitted it to President Obama and Arne Duncan, saying that this education reform, No Child Left Behind, it's in the wrong path. You're disenfranchising all children, but specifically and most importantly, you're disenfranchising special needs, second language, and minority students. They made suggestions how to change the direction. They made suggestions for the reauthorization of No Child Left Behind. They were going to hold a press conference and make this the general public. Well, Arne Duncan interceded and brought them all into the White House and did something to pacify them. The document exists, though, and you can find it online. I'll make sure Parrish has the information, but the document does exist. You also had a statement by the NAACP in 2010 that felt, although they supported charter school movement, like many of us. As an educator, I thought charter schools were a good idea as well, as long as they were district managed and governed. But they made a statement about the privatized charter school movement, and they were a scathing criticism of how this is doing nothing but taking money away from the traditional public schools, and it's enriching a few corporate entities, and it was very scathing. That needs to stop. That document is published as well. But the civil rights organizations, we are starting to link up. This past Saturday, Rainbow Push held a forum, and one of our Save Our Schools steering committee members was invited to that dialogue. So we're starting to see those of us that have been education activists through United Opt-out and Save Our Schools are now linking up with the major civil rights organizations to try and change what's going on. Yes. Well, in the teachers' colleges, and one of the things at summit that I was at in Selma, the teachers in the universities are unfortunately, they're starting to be held under what I call sanction and siege too. They're starting to make them implement Common Core, and they're starting to, one of the things that's coming down the pipe for college professors is that their job security, they're talking about tracing the teachers that come under their particular education programs as they're being placed in school communities and as the value-added measure is being used for them, whether they're proficient or not. They're going to link them to those college professors, and they'll judge those college professors based on what their students do when they get out in the work world. Now, how egregious is that? But that's what they're looking at. And they are organizing, and they're very vocal. Many of the educators involved in Save Our Schools are teachers that are teaching education majors in some of our colleges and universities. So many of them are being very vocal and taking an activist stance as well. I mean, how egregious is that? There's a whole lot of fiction going on if you haven't noticed. I mean, the fact that I received $1,250, I'm not going to turn it down. I've been without a raise for the last 4 years. However, there was fiction attached to that. And there's a fiction attached to a lot of this. Let me talk about, Diane Ravitch refers to them as the Billionaire Boys Club. Now, how many of you are familiar with Diane Ravitch? So you know what her narrative is. She used to push these same reforms. She thought, okay, this is where we need to go. But after observing and looking at the true evidence, she reversed course, and she began to talk about how these are damaging. This is not enhancing the quality of public education. And she's to the point now where she's going around nationally presenting all of this information to the community and making people aware of the lies and the mistruths that are going on attached to these reforms and whatnot. So she's being a real champion and trying to help get this message and the word out. And if you haven't read her book, you may want to. She has an addendum to it, too, that she published recently. Did I answer a question here? I think I may have. Did I answer? Okay. Anybody else? Questions, comments? Yes. Oh, okay. Well, and I think they will. You know, oh, he said so we don't leave here. He didn't use the word depressed, but I think you were saying depressed and you know, worried and anxious about the future of our kids. What is being done to try and make things better? That's what you asked? Am I hopeful? I'm hopeful only if the community comes together to say, no, we're not going to let it happen. And I'm out here. You see, I'm traveling. I've been in 4 different cities in the last 3. I'm trying to spread the message. And I will be occupying the DOE at the end of this month. So I think if we wake up and realize that we're being sold a bad bill of goods, that I have hope. I don't think one of the biggest hopes that I have is in the community that I see that is really standing up and opting their kids out at this point are the elementary parents. Because standardized tests for kindergarten and stamping them as low performing and a non-reader at the age of 5. And I mean, again, fiction. I think as the fiction increases, I think people are going to very much fight against this. Bill Gates, when he first came into this, you know, donating his money and his time to education reform, he was doing it the right way. He was funding, providing funding for students to go to higher ed, supporting them while they were getting their degree, and supporting them even up to the point of advanced degrees. But when it came to the point that he started affecting how policies were legislated, and there's a group of people, American Legislative Exchange Council, It's a group that is comprised of politicians and people that are involved in corporate ownership on some level. They are amassing all sorts of money to push particular legislative policies through our state bodies. And education is one piece that they're trying to privatize. They're attacking teachers right now and other public employees, like how they're trying to reduce police force and first responders but public employees across this nation, federal and state, if ALEC gets his way, there'll be no such thing as public employment. And unfortunately, public employment employs more minorities than private industry does. So you're affecting the ability for minorities to earn money in this country. But they're trying to privatize everything. What we see has happened to the housing industry, the same exploitation. They want to do and take that everywhere. And education is the next best with all these billions of dollars that float through state budgets for education. It was a gold mine waiting to be mined, so to speak. And so with these policies, and that's why you have to really look and see what's floating through your legislative bodies. They're getting rid of organized labor. They're getting rid of state paying into pension funds for public employees. They're trying to get rid of the U.S. Post Office. They're trying to affect how we live in America. And when you see the people that at first we wondered what the hell they were doing, that 99 occupation folk, it's real. Money is flowing in one direction now, and they're trying to make it flow even more in that one direction. And they're legislating policies because they're buying the politicians. I mean, when you look at the amount of millionaires that are sitting as our legislators on the state and federal level, poor people don't work as legislators anymore. Can't even say middle class people do hardly anymore. Most of them, when you look at their tax portfolio statements, these guys are $1 million. And look at your current folk that are running for the Republican nomination. But they're essentially bought and paid. But I think we can fight against this, but it takes people taking the time to share information, to form this, what Paris has done here. I know she's met with some resistance, but everybody in here should thank God every day for this woman right here. Yes. Mm-hmm.
Basically, she was saying that our dissent is bad for the community because we're causing people from the Third Army, for example, to not want to move to Sumter if they hear that everything isn't, peaches and cream in the education community. Pardon? Yes, who's also a veteran educator. And she said, of course, after we spoke at length, she kind of changed her mind a little bit and started realizing some things were not quite what she thought. But that's the resistance that we're facing, is that you've got people, Sumter had 20 years of drought in attracting industry. And now all of a sudden we're starting to get industry here, and so everybody's getting more optimistic and saying, okay, everybody be nice and don't say anything you shouldn't say, because we don't want anybody to think this isn't a great place to live. How do you bridge that? How do you break that barrier?
And it truly is a barrier. My response to any time I'm questioned as to what I'm doing, I say two things. Number one, I'm a parent and I have a student in public schools and I have a right to have a say. And number two, I pay taxes. I have a right to have a say. And one of the things that made democracy is the fact that everyone has a voice. And a lot of times through conflict comes resolution. So maybe we have to go through the shakeup before we get to the resolution. I just tell them like that. At one point I was telling, I think I shared it with Paris, I was telling a woman in Charleston that when I first started discovering these things, I hosted a town hall, dug into my pocket, paid for a speaker to come in and address our community. Only 60 people showed up, and we're the 4th largest school district in this country. I was so frustrated. But now, in 2012, our superintendent went up to Tallahassee and said, you can't do this to our kids. So people get on board. As the damage, the collateral damage, as you start looking and watching and observing, people will get on board. People will get on board.
I've been doing a lot of research into this, and I'm deeply rooted in this community. I've been an educator for close to 30 years now. And it's really a complicated subject in terms of how many agendas are really at work here. And one of them is actually an anti-democratic agenda, a top-down anti-democratic. And having taught in multiple levels and a number of different age groups, we want our children to thrive and be creative. We know that everyone is developing individually on a schedule that is not determined by high-stakes testing. We all know that. But there's something really dangerously wrong with what we're seeing right now. And I really do feel that democracy itself is threatened. And that's what I have come to think. But if I am hopeful, and for this reason, in the research that I'm doing, I'm seeing so many statistics pile up to say that this reform movement is not working. And if anything, these schools that cost so much more than our public schools are at best performing as, maybe as well as the public schools. 17% of the privatized schools or the charter schools perform better. 37% do not perform as well, and the rest are on par. And also there's a lot of wickering going on with our comparison of our students to international scores and students as well. We actually, and there's a really interesting person, Ross Stein, if you haven't read him, Richard Ross Stein, he's an economist, and he said the only thing we can really look at will be the NAEP scores. And what they are showing is that we've actually had a very successful experience with the public schools after desegregation until No Child Left Behind came on board. And then the 22% gains were suddenly now 5%. So having seen this from the inside, well, it boils down to this choice for a teacher. Do I take my class to the library to practice taking the test for 3 days and get checked off because I know somebody's watching this, the district office is monitoring this, or do I teach them Shakespeare? Or do I teach them something else? Or do I teach them another way of thinking? No, and it boils down to multiplying that over and over again through the year, and then times classes, then times schools, then times states, and you see what we're up against. So it's really reducing the amount of time that students actually learn important things. And I've seen it firsthand.
Exactly. I had the same questions you're asking. We had Save Our Schools, before we did our march, we had webinars where we invited people from the national community that we felt had something that they could share with us to teach us and help us and guide us in this movement of trying to reverse the privatization of public education. And one of those people was John Jackson, who is the president of the Schott Foundation. I don't know if you're familiar with the Schott Foundation, but they do a lot of work trying to advocate for young black males in regards to the school-to-prison pipeline, in regards to the dropout rate, in regards to the high murder rate, of young boys killing each other. They address that particular social problem. And they also take on the larger issue of education here in America. So he was sharing with us very important information. And at one point I asked him, but, well, how do we make a change? How do we make a difference? Sure, we can march, sure, we can call our legislators, sure, we can do this. And I said, but this doesn't seem to be working. What can we do? And he said, you continue organizing, you continue marching, you bring more people in along the way, and you just keep doing what you're doing and keep at it. And to me, it wasn't a satisfactory answer, and I kept pushing him, and he got a little snappy with me by the end of that conversation. And when the webinar was over, I thought about it, and I was so frustrated and thinking, this is a battle that we're going to lose. We're not going to have public school. We're going to have severe segregation and racism just run rampant all over America again. And, you know, I was frustrated, but I started seeing along the way small successes. And like I said, at one point where I was called a troublemaker, and I almost, to the point I was going to get suspended from my job for 6 weeks for sending information that they said violated ethics to civil rights organizations in regards to what I saw them doing to black children inside the public schools. But two people stood up for me, a senator in Florida and a reporter. And on our watch, you're not going to do that to her. This is an excellent educator. But that, along with other things, started giving me hope, started leading me to believe things can change. And that same superintendent, like I said, he was going to suspend me for 6 weeks. But when I saw him go this year before Tallahassee and say, you're not going to do this on my watch, you know, things change. If people start saying, when the housing industry ended up sinking, it's because somebody finally said you can't keep exploiting. You can't keep doing this illegal, what is it, swapping, trading, all the stuff that we're doing. It's really, really illegal and really criminal. Legalized crime is, I guess, what it is. Eventually, I think the same thing's going to happen in regards to people defending democracy. They're not going to allow them to take it away. Even with their high-tech gadgets and instruments, even with the fact that many of our rights are eroding that were constantly guaranteed us by the Constitution, I think people are just not going to accept it. And I think enough people will stand up, and I hope it doesn't turn into anarchy, but if it goes there, what can I say? But I think we can do it just by being proactive and just by voicing. When you see things going wrong in your educational institutions, organizing, making sure that you have a majority that's there with you and not one person is being set out there on that limb by themselves. But I think I do have hope. I don't know why, but I do. Yes. Well, Eli Broad is one of those billionaire boys that decided he was going to have a hand in legislating or affecting the legislation that goes on with education policy. And he's donated goo-gobs, bunches of money in various different ways. And one way, he's set up this Superintendent's Academy where he pulls people from various different walks of life, but they've all got one thing in common. They've experienced management on some level, whether it's in the military, whether it's in education, whether it's in the business world. And he brings them in and trains them on the weekends to become superintendents of public school systems. And he sends them with an agenda to help privatize education. And usually they come into the communities and they implement policies that lean in that direction, where they're privatizing education. And many of them come with the intent to be faithful to the Broad Academy and to the teachings, and they're getting paid very well. But I think somewhere there are those that realize they're employed by particular communities, and they have to bend and they have to adjust to the community, and they begin working with the community and what the community wants. So I can't say all of them stick to that agenda to help implement the market-based reforms, but they are certainly trained to do so. And they try and do the sell job to the community that this is where we got to go with things. He's here. At the same time, you have a governor that is applying for the waiver, which will usher in more of the market-based reforms. And as a community, you guys can organize right now to decide what you want to deal with and what you don't want to deal with. We can also, even though it looks difficult, one thing we can do is make sure we cast votes for those that support democracy as opposed to those that support private profit and the 1% taking over all of our economy. So I think communication is the key. I know many times people come with an agenda, but it can be modified. And I think you could work with. But that particular academy is for the purpose of training superintendents to come into communities. And many times it's communities that have a high population of minority students that are sitting in what they like to call failing schools. There's one other thing about the failing school thing. When they use reading as an indicator, and when they use math scores as an indicator of failing schools, there's fiction in that as well. That's one of my biggest problems that I have, is that you're deeming these people failing, but when you go in these schools, you see many things that are going on successfully. When I got to Norland, I saw kids that were going to Ivy League schools when they were leaving. I saw kids in AP programs. I saw kids when I work with kids, like any other school, like the supposedly high-performing school. There were kids that loved the challenge of learning, and there were kids that you had to push to love the challenge of learning. There was no difference. There was no difference in the intellectual capabilities. You have children, wherever I've gone, I have children that are working to support themselves because there's no adult. I have children that may not get a meal that night. I have children that have no health care insurance that got a cat. I had one kid in particular had a cat bite. The cat bite got infected, and I told him, you've got to go to emergency room. I don't have any insurance, Miss Smith. My mom won't let me go. It'll be another bill. He ended up almost losing his leg by the time he got to the hospital. So everywhere you go, there are factors that affect how well students are going to learn and how well students are going to grow and develop. One of the main things I hear educators complaining about is that at one time they were able to form those strong relationships with their kids. But now the relationships are strained at best because the kids, you're my paycheck, you're my job security. What's that do? How can you relax when you know these kids depend on, you know, how well they do on a test depends on if you're able to feed your family in the next year or two. So that alone shows you, to me, that we're headed in a wrong direction. And people are exploring the fact that maybe this is a violation of labor laws because you're making students work for your pay. So one of the other things that we have to do, which is being done on many levels, is get our labor organizations to start the litigation process, get our civil rights organizations to start the litigation process. Because when you think back historically with the civil rights movement, they were marching in the street, but they were in those courtrooms too. So we have to start getting those lawyers that will step up and start fighting the battles in the courtroom as well. I know the first year I actually get paid or evaluated based on fiction, I'm filing the suit. I got to wait till we get there, but I'm going to file the suit. And I'm going to have a judge tell me this is fair. So we have to start organizing on that level as well.
Our security guards are going to be leaving shortly. That's my only concern. So we probably need to wind down. But if you do have a question for Ceresta, please, as we exit, you can come and ask her. And we also have some index cards on the table, and we'd love for you to write a question or comment down, and I can consult with Ceresta, and if you leave your email address, I can get back with you. We're not going to meet this Thursday. We usually meet the Thursday after the board meeting at Angel's Restaurant, but since we're meeting tonight, Angel's on Main, but I believe it's the 29th of March will be the next Thursday after the board meeting. So thank you, and please, let's give Ceresta a hand. I'm so glad she's been here.